Today I speak with Asher Orkaby, a former Wilson Center Fellow and currently lecturer and research associate at Harvard University, on the latest developments that are very rapidly changing and unfolding in Israel and the Palestinian territories. It is day 11 since the Hamas attack on Israel and the war in Gaza. To date, more than 1,400 Israelis have been killed and over 3,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. Secretary Blinken is in the region, and President Biden is getting ready for his trip to Israel and Jordan tomorrow. The war is intensifying, causing jitters across the Middle East and North Africa region amongst the leadership as well as the people about a potential expansion of this war beyond Gaza, a scenario that U.S. diplomatic efforts have been laser focused on this past week. Asher, thank you so much for joining us to weigh in on the current situation. Many in the region and here in Washington have been saying that this war is an inflection point for the Middle East, that after that, we're going to see a paradigm shift. What is your reading of the developments and the Biden administration's response so far?
Interesting that you say. First of all, thank you again for having me back to the Wilson Center. You provide such wonderful insight through the center that both as an alumni and as a regular consumer of Middle East news, I'm always coming back to the program. So you have many more good years of contributing at the Wilson Center. So in terms of, it's interesting you said a paradigm shift. I don't really see anything change. It's not that Hamas became a different organization, or that Hezbollah became a different organization, or that Israel became a different state. It's very much the same. There certainly was shock. All the tragedy is unspeakable on both sides. But what's really changed is, I think, a wake-up call to everyone that the status quo was not a peaceful status quo, but rather one that was really a powder keg, willing on the verge of exploding, and that's essentially what happened in the past few days.
And so many leaders in the region have been talking about this and have been sending cautionary messages about the centrality of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But U.S. engagement in the region, with the Biden administration in particular, this was not really a priority. But in the last few months, the top priority for President Biden and his administration was to forge a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Do you think the timing of the Hamas attack is linked to that?
It's without a doubt that this attack was planned months in advance. So the timing of it probably began around the beginning of the Abraham Accords, where it seemed that the solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict was not going to be between the two warring parties themselves, but rather through external actors, external Arab nations who would be making peace with Israel and then trying to extol certain concessions or changes from Israel, even pro forma ones, in order to go back to the Arab street, go back to their constituents and say, look, we've pushed Israel in one direction or another. So it seems like that was the point where certainly the planning had begun. But at the same time, there was also a shift within Hamas itself to move away from the Gulf countries. This is gradually over the past 10 years, and certainly to a much greater degree over the past 3 years, of moving far closer to Iran. In certainly the planning for this, whether Iran called the actual beginning of the launched the beginning of the attack, or whether this was something that was run by Hamas. But it's very clear that Hamas is moving out of the Gulf orbit, where previously a lot of the funding, the Qatari funding, the Emirati funding, had come to support the Palestinian, both the PLO and Hamas. It seems like the Hamas has made a very significant shift over to Iran, and I think that changed the dynamics significantly over the past 3 years.
And with Iran's support financially, politically, and militarily through, providing them with weapons, etc., we've heard President Biden recently note that there is no clear evidence that Iran was involved in the planning or was informed of the plan itself, the plan of attack. However, the Iranian foreign minister has been conducting his own shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East and talking to all the different non-state actors, in particular, from Hezbollah to Hamas and others that his country supports. And we've heard also from other Iranian officials about the danger of escalation. Given how intense the situation is in the region today, where do you think this is going? Particularly given that the United States diplomacy is laser focused on preventing escalation further, and that is definitely a message that Tony Blinken heard from many Arab leaders he's met with over the course of the last few days.
So there's a couple of responses that I have to your statement. One is regarding the Biden administration's intentional decision to remove Iran from many of the public declarations. And that was intentional for a number of reasons. I think we can call this international reaction to the war a international war of statements, right? Many statements have been made, many statements have been retracted, both on the national level and on the local level, with organizations being pressured to make particular statements of one kind or another. Hollywood actors, celebrities, and everyone has been pressured to make their statements in one direction or another. And that's certainly telling, because what's included and what's not included in a particular statement is often done intentionally. In this case, certainly it was done intentionally, both because this is an election year in the United States, and to admit that Iran may have had a more or involved or less involved role within the planning of this Hamas attack would have admitted culpability on the side of the Biden administration, especially as the Biden administration has moved towards a reconciliation with Iran, one that may have not been in good taste, certainly in retrospect, and it's an election year. So that's partially to explain the choice of words. But then again, we go back to that first statement I made, that the war itself is a war of statements, right? And every country, certainly in the Middle East, and broadly, has had to make their statements. Iran has made their statements, bellicosity. Hezbollah has made their statements, but it doesn't seem, I think you're correct in that analysis, is that there's no interest in a much broader war. Certainly, the movement of military pieces by the United States is in effect to prevent that war, but it seems like there is no interest in a broader war. And it's not just because of the diplomatic interest, but it's more because of the general fear of the Hamas-style popularity spreading much further beyond just Gaza and the West Bank, and spreading to other countries as well, potentially destabilizing regions, destabilizing political stability within many of these countries.
And speaking of support for Hamas, or perhaps just the anger that we've seen in the Arab streets, there have been rallies this past weekend, and as we speak right now, there are pro-Palestinian rallies, basically in Amman, Tunis, and Ramallah, as Israel continues its bombardment in Gaza, and as the death toll increases, particularly on the civilian side in Gaza. So how do you think this is something that the US administration can help balance at this point, given that President Biden is heading to the region tomorrow to visit Israel, to shore up support for Israel, but also to visit Jordan and meet with King Abdullah, President Sisi of Egypt, and as planned, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas who just canceled the meeting after the strike that killed hundreds at the Mamadani hospital.
So this is not the first, certainly as a historian, I can tell you this is not the first time there have been massive rallies in support of the Palestinian movement or even anti-Israel Palestinian movements across the Arab world. This is certainly not the first. It won't be the last. Right. So there certainly is an analysis of question of what is the shawara, what does the street say, what does the Arab street say, and it's not a single voice, right? It's certainly not a collective voice either. But there's obviously many different factions, many different groups within the Arab street, and there's certainly a great deal of tension within the Arab street in terms of the population glued to social media and jumping on reports of one atrocity or another and then responding to it in kind. And certainly there's nothing that any one country or administration can do to control public access to media and information. That's the effect of a decentralized information structure, right? Not everybody's getting their news from CNN anymore. So that's certainly part of the modern warfare, something we've seen certainly in Russia and Ukraine, that wars are fought on social media, wars are fought on the internet, just as much as they're being fought on the ground, right? Every action taken or not taken is going to be analyzed again and again by the population. So there's nothing that Biden can do or nothing that one can do other than have action and reaction. Every country has a public relations media branch that's growing larger and larger, right? So that's certainly not the case. What I found surprising, though, is that in Sana'a in particular, the large protests in Sana'a, whether they were natural, right, everyone coming out, or whether they were orchestrated by the Houthi movement, was surprising, given the crisis within Yemen itself. The fact that all of the attention, the public attention, was diverted away from the Houthis, away from the humanitarian crisis, and only towards Hamas and the war in Israel. I found that surprising, although perhaps unsurprising.
And so, of course, you follow Yemen very closely as an expert on the conflict in Yemen and the history of Yemen in particular. So one last question, Asher, regarding how this is going to impact the Abraham Accords with the current signatories, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. We know that reports have been out about the Saudis, pausing talks or halting talks, of course, with Israel, and reports about Mohammed bin Salman keeping Secretary Blinken waiting for hours before the meeting took place just a few days ago. So that is something that is noted. However, how is it going to impact other countries? The United Arab Emirates and Bahrain are the only two Arab countries that condemned Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians and Hamas attacks in general.
I think there's a fear of Hamas popularity and ideology spreading far beyond just the Levant region. And this is something that's shared not only by the UAE and Bahrain, perhaps the only two countries that had the best security government-wise in order to make statements openly without worrying about public repercussions because of the amount of control that's exercised within both Bahrain and in the Emirates. But certainly this is something that I'm sure is being discussed within Riyadh, within Amman. What happens if that Hamas is seen as for certainly in the eyes of many across the Arab world, is seen as the victors, right? As horrific as the atrocities were, and they certainly were. But Hamas emerges as a victor, right? Through whatever means they took, but they emerge in the eyes of history, at least within the Arab world and the current contemporary, view is a victory. And that's very frightening for the surrounding countries, because that means that that type of populist militant ideology could spread to other countries. Certainly Jordan would be the most frightened of this type of ideology coming, which could destabilize the monarchy. Even Hezbollah, for all its rhetoric, would certainly be concerned by a Hamas-style populist ideology taking hold within Sabra and Shatila, the two major Palestinian refugee camps outside of Beirut, potentially destabilizing an already unstable Lebanese government, and also rivaling Hezbollah for a populist type government. This is frightening for the Saudis that have a large Palestinian population. This is frightening for the Gulfies. None of them have, throughout history, have opened their doors to Palestinian refugees. Saudi Arabia, notoriously after 1990, removed many of them from the country. The tensions between the two groups have been very longstanding. Right, so I think there's a general fear of that populist militant ideology coming to those countries. So yes, public rhetoric, but in the end of the day, there's only so far that these countries are going to go in order to uphold what they're, to back up the kind of statements that they're making. So I think it's walking a very fine line, but in the general interest, there is a concern both for that militant style ideology, the populist ideology, but also there's a general concern for Iran. And I think that's ultimately going to keep those countries together, because they see Hamas, even if they don't say it out loud the way that the Emirates did, they see Iran certainly as the biggest threat that they're facing. And it's manifested certainly by the type of attack that Hamas carried out against Israel in the past 11 days.
Asher Orkaby, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for your analysis and your time.
Can I add just an observation about Yemen to make that connection?
Sure.
What I found it surprising to find to look at Sana'a and the type of protests that were happening within Sana'a itself. There's a lot of similarities, probably more similarities between the Houthi movement and Hamas than between Hamas and Hezbollah, both in the type of tactics, the type of public relations campaigns. But what was most surprising was the political strategy exercised by dictators within the Middle East for decades, was to divert public attention away from domestic crises and focus on international conflict. Saddam Hussein did this effectively time and time again to focus on an international crisis. Many of the countries in the Arab world have focused specifically on the Israel-Palestine conflict, moving away from their domestic crises. This was certainly to move away from economic crises, human rights violations, and instead focus on international conflict. This was classic. The fact that the Houthis are doing that as well, I found very surprising, because the Houthis, Abdel Malik al-Houthi, came out specifically with a threat against Israel, saying that if you enter Gaza, the Houthis are going to either send drones to Israel or more effectively blockade this the Bab al-Mandeb, the southern gates of the Red Sea. That could potentially destabilize the region, but it also gives you an idea of just how far the Houthis have come, both in terms of their control over Yemen, but also specifically in terms of the collaboration strategically between the various different groups that receive funding or support from Iran. So in terms of where the region is going, that's certainly a very frightening scenario, one that can destabilize not just the Levant region, but international shipping, security, oil supply. So certainly that's more concerning in some ways than the day-to-day of what's happening along the border.
And a reminder of the interconnectedness of a lot of these different issues and the ongoing conflicts that are still live conflicts, be it in Syria, Libya, and to your point, in Yemen. So thank you once again.
Okay.